Well, g'day. Let me start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thanks, Pat, for the invitation to speak tonight. Pat Ranald has been a determined and effective advocate on trade issues for 3 decades, and her advocacy has had an impact on Australia and Australian policy making. I'm very sorry I can't be with you all tonight, but I'm in Port Moresby working with business, government and civil society in Papua New Guinea to broaden our regional trade relationships, to make sure they support economic development, regional resilience and equity here in Australia and in Papua New Guinea as well. I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words about the new government's direction on trade, and grateful, after I indicated that I couldn't attend in person, that Pat didn't sack me and replace me with a real live speaker. Trade policy, the pursuit of trade agreements, Australia's interaction with the bilateral, regional, plurilateral and multilateral fora have, over the last 4 decades, been directed largely towards the singular objective of economic growth. It has contributed to growth, and Australians have benefited. But that growth has not been evenly spread. As a former leader of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, I know all too well the negative impacts of trade liberalisation, particularly for our outer suburbs and industrial regions. Removing trade barriers and liberalising global trade have been the focus of previous governments. But the world and the region that Australia inhabits, its challenges and its opportunities, they are starkly different to the world and the region that Australia faced in the 1990s. The challenge of climate and adaptation to rising temperatures, the related challenge of economic development, industrialisation, rapidly escalating demand for energy and emissions reduction in our region, the fastest growing region of the world in human history. The security challenge, defending sovereignty and national resilience for Australia and our regional neighbours in a new era of competition where trade and trade impediments have been a tool of statecraft. And finally, the rising challenge of regional and global food security, exacerbated by the impact of dangerous and accelerating climate change on food production systems. The old Howard era adage that Australia's economic and security interests were distinct and that they should be kept separate wasn't right then, but the complacency it fostered must be swept away now in this new regional and global epoch. Trade plays an essential role in all of these challenges. Indeed, what you'll see from the Albanese government is the Australian government deploying all of the tools of statecraft: trade, diplomacy, defence, aid and development, investment, industry and economic policy, defending and strengthening our democracy, improving the skills of the Australian people, leading with the challenge of climate and emissions here and abroad. All of these tools of statecraft, all in the national interest, and directed towards making our region safe, peaceful, more equal and prosperous. Late last year, my senior colleague, Trade and Tourism Minister Don Farrell, set out a useful framework for the Albanese government's approach to international trade. Don talked about 4 essential things that we're wanting to do in trade and investment policy, 4 ingredients for building Australia's economic security and prosperity with a distinctly Labor lens applied to those goals. A lens that focuses on fairness and social equity, while at the same time delivering meaningful and sustainable economic growth. A lens that is broad and sees the world as it is, not how we would wish it to be, and credibly shapes that world and the region in Australia's interests and in the interests of peace and security for future generations. That sees the way in which geopolitical pressures, peace, security and prosperity interact, and shape our trade and investment agenda around this, in line with our national interest. First, Don talked about our diversification agenda, our belief that Australia is best served by having a diverse group of trading partners and making sure that our exports have markets all around the world, and that we pursue, as well as market diversity, product diversity, pushing Australia's exports higher up the global value chain, building Australian manufacturing and building Australian industrial capability. We're continuing to stabilise and develop our relationship with China, our biggest export market, at the same time as we deepen our economic ties around the Indo-Pacific and pursue deeper trade ties inside Europe as well. Don Farrell has just now returned from travel to China. Indeed, I travelled there earlier this year to the Bao Forum in Hainan Province in China. Second, Don set out how important it is that we continue to defend and reform the global multilateral system. The multilateral system, with the World Trade Organization at its heart, is the vital environment in which that happens, and working to make it better, fairer and more easily navigable by all nations is a critical national investment. Ensuring that the WTO has a credible approach to the big challenges of climate, food security and strengthening rules-based multilateralism is crucially in Australia's interest. Third, Don talked about the link between international trade and investment and growing Australian jobs and industries. As many economies around the world continue to struggle, particularly with inflation, and as we work alongside all nations in the critical task of rebuilding cleaner economies this century through decarbonisation, we know that Australian jobs and incomes will be more resilient, our industries more nimble if we have a more diverse economic profile. But also, critically, in laying out this framework, Don talked about fairness. He made the point that as much as we work to build the strength of the Australian economy and jobs through our international trade work, we also are committed to making sure that the benefits of trade reach all Australians, that our prosperity is shared right across our community. We recognise that in seeking to advance Australia's material prosperity through trade, we have to take a simultaneous social and progressive lens to the work that we are doing. It's critical that we maintain high labour, gender and environmental standards through our free trade agreements and our trade relationships more broadly. I'm pleased to say that Australia is now pursuing the inclusion of labour, gender and environment provisions in our new free trade agreements and in our upgrades of existing free trade agreements to ensure that the benefits of trade flow to the entire Australian community. Of Australia's 17 free trade agreements in force, 4 have environment and labour chapters: the bilateral free trade agreements with the United States, Peru and Korea, and the CPTPP. The UK agreement will also be Australia's first trade agreement to contain a chapter on trade and gender equality. The Australia-UK agreement also includes a dedicated provision on modern slavery, including efforts to ensure that parties' private and public sector entities take appropriate steps to prevent modern slavery in their supply chains. In the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we're seeking to lift the region's ambition on implementing and enforcing labour standards, in addition to enhancing transparency around instances of non-adherence to these standards. This is central to the American and indeed to Australia's ambitions for this vital regional agreement. Crucially, for many IPEF members, this would be the first time that they include such commitments in any agreement. In the Australia and New Zealand ASEAN Free Trade Agreement upgrade negotiations, parties have agreed to the inclusion of a standalone trade and sustainable development chapter, focusing on environmental protection, labour and women's economic empowerment. Advancing and including First Nations people through trade is also a priority for this government, and it will be part of our trade agenda. The Albanese government will not include investor-state dispute settlement clauses in any future trade agreements. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the trade agreements with the EU and India currently under negotiation will not include investor-state dispute settlement clauses. Where Australia already has ISDS obligations, the government will ensure that our approach preserves the right to regulate in the public interest, including in relation to the environment and public health. When opportunities arise, the government will actively engage in processes to reform existing ISDS mechanisms. I recognise the continued advocacy on ISDS clauses that AFTINET, together with the trade union movement broadly, has pursued over many, many years. This is fundamentally an issue of fairness and of preserving the government's ability to govern in the national interest. On the environment, promoting a sustainable and inclusive trade and investment system is a core priority that Australia will take to the IPEF negotiations. IPEF members have committed to sharing the benefits and opportunities afforded by this important work, that they are accessed and shared by all. Australia and New Zealand are co-chairing negotiations on the IPEF's Inclusivity Chapter, which seeks to eliminate barriers to participation in international trade and investment and economic growth, particularly for women, Indigenous peoples, people with disability, rural and remote populations, minorities and local communities. We don't just want more trade, we want fairer trade. We want trade that is transparent, that protects workers' rights, trade that maintains the right of countries to regulate in the interests of all of their peoples, that gives people access to affordable medicines and generally looks after all of our communities. Of course, Australia's approach to international and economic policy will be unique to our own position in the region. Australia, on the edge of the fastest growing region of the world in human history, cannot afford a return to protectionism. A purposeful approach to shaping the trade and investment agenda in the interests of all Australians, with an eye to ensuring the most vulnerable in our communities benefit from Australia's economic growth, and that we build social and economic inclusion for a stronger, fairer and more resilient Australia. I want to thank you, AFTINET, for your part in this whole of nation effort. I wish all of you all the best for a great dinner. I hope you have a terrific evening. Thank you very much.